Tonight, let the room grow a little dimmer around you, and let the world grow a little older. Somewhere beyond the soft edge of your lamp, beyond the window glass, beyond the century that has given you switches and heaters and clocks that keep honest time, there is another landscape waiting. It is colder there, the walls sweat in winter, the rushes on the floor hide crumbs, ash and secrets. Horses blow steam into the dark, a bell sounds from a chapel no one can quite afford, and in the middle of all that damp stone and inherited ceremony, someone is being called Your Majesty for the very first time. That is where our night begins, not with a great conqueror, not with a sainted ruler, not with a king carved in marble, with perfect judgment in his brow, but with a quieter and stranger question. What happens when a crown falls on the wrong head? What happens when a kingdom, with all its taxes and harvests and borders and anxieties and hungry people and watchful enemies, places its whole future into the hands of a person who is frightened, vain, indecisive, sickly, angry, absent, or simply not equal to the weight of it? Because that is one of the soft, uncomfortable truths of medieval history. A crown was not always a reward for wisdom. More often, it was an accident of birth wrapped in velvet and lit by candles. It went to the nearest son, the surviving nephew, the infant in the cradle, the youth with the best bloodline, the man with the most convincing claim, the boy whose elder brothers had died too soon, the princeling no one would have trusted with a purse, but whom everyone agreed must now hold a kingdom together. And the kingdom, poor thing, usually had no choice. So tonight we are not really gathering a list of foolish kings and placing them one by one on a shelf. That would be too easy, and strangely too shallow for a subject like this. Instead, we are walking through an old gallery of failed rule, a long corridor where each portrait is lit by the same wavering flame. Some faces are cruel, some are blank, some look tired before they have even begun. Some are children playing at majesty, while adults carve away the realm around them. Some are men who might have been decent in another life, on another scale, in another century, if only they had been born to inherit an orchard or a mill instead of a throne. But history did not give them orchards, it gave them crowns, and a crown, in the Middle Ages, was a dangerous thing. It was gold and silk and processions. Yes, it was also mud, letters, famine, marriage alliances, traitorous cousins, armed bishops, offended nobles, unpaid soldiers, rotting bridges, disputed succession, sudden plagues, winter grain, river crossings, mercenaries, oaths no one intended to keep, and 1,000 eyes watching for weakness. A king was expected to be a war leader, judge, father, symbol, tax collector, peacemaker, punisher, negotiator, and at times a kind of walking miracle. He was expected to frighten enemies, calm allies, reward service, punish rebellion, and somehow make the whole restless machine of his kingdom feel inevitable and ordained. And yet, the man inside the robes was often heartbreakingly ordinary. Or worse than ordinary, imagine, if you like, a narrow table in a drafty hall, wax running down the candles, a map held flat with daggers, a collection of men in fur and mail, waiting for a decision that will determine whether they march, whether they starve, whether they betray each other, whether the river line is held, whether the treasury empties, whether someone must ride through snow to beg for aid. At the head of the table sits the king. Everyone watches him. The whole room leans very slightly toward his mouth, and he has no idea what to do. That moment, more than any battle trumpet or coronation hymn, is the true music of tonight. You can feel already why such stories linger. They are grand, certainly. They are also intimate, in a way that heroic history often is not. A failed king is not just a date and a treaty. He is a voice in a room, a hesitation at the wrong hour, a temper where calm was needed, a softness where steel was expected, a dreamer where the age demanded a harder hand, a boy where the world required a man. Sometimes the great hinge of a century turns not on genius, but on confusion. And because this is history for sleep, because we are not here to rattle ourselves awake with outrage, or cram the mind with too much iron and noise, we will take these rulers slowly. We will let the pattern emerge in a gentler way. We will notice the chill of the stone before we notice the law that was signed there. We will notice the breath of horses before the battle line forms. We will notice the tired eyes, the petulant mouths, the heavy rings, the ink on a decree, the wet hem of a cloak, the silence before a bad decision hardens into reality. If, somewhere along the way, this quiet walk through old power begins to feel like a place you would like to return to on another evening, you can simply let this channel remain nearby for the next candlelit journey. No need to stir too much, no need to do anything more than keep listening. For now, let the mind loosen. Europe is spread beneath us in fragments, England under cloud and argument, Francia split and resplit, the German lands uneasy and watchful, Scotland listening toward its border, Bohemia tucked among rival powers, Castile hot with old family hatreds, Hungary facing danger from the plains, Sicily glowing briefly in the south before the tide turns. Everywhere the same fragile arrangement, a throne, a lineage, a court, a set of expectations too large for the human frame. And tonight, one by one, that frame will fail, not always spectacularly, not always with obvious stupidity. Some of these men will blunder in full view, some will simply drift, some will be broken by pressure before they can even shape a will of their own. Some will ruin what stronger ancestors built, some will inherit systems already cracked and only reveal how cracked they were. Some will leave behind something strangely useful, a charter, a caution, a legal memory, a dynastic opening, a rumor of treasure, a story that later ages laugh at, because laughter is kinder than admitting how much suffering followed. So settle into the softness of the telling. There will be kings tonight who paid enemies to go away and taught them to return richer. Kings who lost provinces as if they were gloves. Kings who sat on great inheritances and let them slide through their fingers. Kings whose nobles became so exhausted by their rule that rebellion began to feel like a public service. Kings who could not command their courts. Kings who could not command themselves. Kings who never truly held power at all, though crowns were placed on their heads and prayers were said over them all the same. And beneath them all, like the low hum beneath a storm, there will be the same old medieval machine. Birth mistaken for fitness, ceremony mistaken for strength, bloodline mistaken for wisdom, a system so certain that God had chosen the ruler, even when the ruler looked as though he had been chosen by accident. Exhaustion, or cruel divine irony. That is the machine we are entering now, and it is easier to see in the evening, when the loud claims of greatness have quieted and all that remains is the candle flame, the old parchment, the damp hall, and the man at the centre of it, trying, failing, pretending, or simply sinking. So let the crown lower gently onto the first head, let the bell sound, let the room grow still enough to hear a kingdom hold its breath. Before we meet any one ruler in particular, it helps to feel the shape of the world that made them. A medieval kingdom was not a neat machine, not really. It was a patchwork of obligations and fears stitched together by roads that became mud, by rivers that rose at the wrong season, by letters that travelled slowly, by marriages that were half diplomacy and half hostage exchange, by barons who smiled in court and fortified against the king at home, by bishops who could bless an army in the morning and undermine a throne before dusk. Authority did not pour evenly outward from the crown. It leaked, it pooled, it snagged on regional loyalties and family grudges. It had to be renewed constantly in person, in speech, in judgment, in favour, in punishment. And that meant a ruler could not simply be crowned and left alone. He had to be felt. He had to feel real in the provinces, in the abbeys, in the towns, in the borderlands where his banners might never appear except on parchment. He had to seem dangerous enough that enemies thought twice, generous enough that allies remained allies, steady enough that frightened men could build their plans around his continued existence and judgment. He had to make order seem possible, not perfect order, because the Middle Ages were never perfect and never quiet, but enough order that harvesters would sow, merchants would travel, lords would delay revolt for one more season, and clerics would speak of divine favour with a straight face. When a king failed at that, the failure spread in very ordinary ways. Grain carts did not arrive, garrison towns doubted the next supply, local lords tested the edges of their obedience, one disputed marriage became a faction, one weak answer became a rumour of weakness, one missed chance to act became two, then six, then a winter, then a war. And there was another problem, perhaps the oldest one of all: childhood. The medieval world had no special reverence for waiting until a person was ready. If the rightful heir was 9 months old, then a 9-month-old was king. If the rightful heir was 6, then 6. If the rightful claimant was pious but timid, distracted but legitimate, melancholy but correctly born, then legitimacy itself carried him upward. Around him gathered councils, regents, ambitious uncles, widowed queens, land-hungry cousins, ministers with their own clients, and all the rest of the buzzing human life that attaches itself to power, the way ivy attaches itself to stone. The child at the centre might be ornament, hostage, symbol, vessel, or blank page. Rarely was he master. Even grown kings were often less free than they appeared. They inherited expectations, old treaties, debts, territorial claims no one could realistically maintain, and the emotional weather of their dynasty. If a father had conquered brilliantly, the son inherited not only land but comparison. If an empire had recently expanded, the next ruler inherited not only glory but overextension. If a family had long depended on the myth of strength, then even one gentle, hesitant, over-prayerful man could feel like a crack running through the whole house. And that perhaps is why failed kings are so revealing. Great kings can sometimes hide the machine. Their victories make the whole system look wiser than it was. But weak kings expose everything. They expose how much depends on timing, personality, health, and luck. They expose how quickly divine right begins to look flimsy when a realm is starving. They expose how thin the line can be between majesty and farce. Think of the crown again, not as a jewel, but as a test no one studied for. One ruler will face raiders and answer with tribute. Another will face rebellious nobles and answer with spite. Another will inherit a great empire and respond with delay so deep it almost becomes a governing philosophy. Another will barely emerge from childhood before disease, faction, and military pressure dissolve his authority around him. Another will be so inward, so withdrawn, so unlike the age he inhabits, that his kingdom begins to fight itself just to fill the void. It would be easy to sneer at them from a distance. Easy too, and not entirely wrong, but the slower and more interesting thing is to watch how failure forms. Not all at once, not with a single stupid decree, more like frost in stone, more like rot in beams, more like a silence at the council table where a firm answer should have been. So let us enter quietly. Let us not rush into battle yet. Let us first walk the outer passages of these kingdoms. Feel the dampness in a Norman keep, the stale warmth of a chamber where petitions wait unopened, the uneasy grandeur of a hall hung with trophies from a stronger generation, the weight of velvet on thin shoulders, the smell of wax and old fur and tired horses, the scratch of a quill that may change the fate of thousands. And remember, as always, that you are not inside their danger. You are outside it, warm enough, listening from another time. Their storms do not need to become your own. Their bad choices are already old. Their armies are dust. Their banners long collapsed. The men who shouted their names are gone. Even the stones have weathered since then. All that remains for us is the pattern. And the pattern begins, very often, with a king who mistakes the throne for a shield rather than a burden. A king who believes that being born to rule must somehow mean knowing how. A king who thinks law is there to serve his moods. A king who imagines the kingdom can absorb every petty cruelty and every delayed decision forever. It cannot, no kingdom can. Sooner or later, the parchment comes out. The nobles gather. The invaders return. The cousins sharpen their claims. The city gates close. The coins run thin. The whispers turn into facts. And by then the king, if he notices at all, often notices too late. So now the corridor narrows. The portraits draw closer together. We are ready to step from the machine to the men. The first kind of failure is loud enough to hear from a distance. It stomps, scowls, overreaches, alienates, taxes, threatens, and insists on its own rightness, even while the floorboards buckle underneath it. This is the failure of the ruler who wounds his own legitimacy with his own hands. And on such nights, England gives us more than one example. Begin in England with a king who managed the rare trick of making limits on royal power seem not merely desirable, but urgently necessary. You can picture him in a tent at Runnymede if you like, though what matters most is not the furniture of the scene, but the feeling. The air is hot and sour with June. Horses shift outside. Armed men wait just beyond the canvas. Across from the king sit nobles who have exhausted patience and now wish to try law. That alone tells you how badly matters have gone. Men of this rank and temper do not usually come to the king asking for moderation because they believe in universal justice. They come because the alternative has become intolerable. This is King John of England, youngest surviving son of a formidable house. Brother to the gleaming legend of Richard the Lionheart, inheritor less of admiration than of comparison. He was not supposed to be the dazzling one. History had not really prepared a graceful role for him. Yet, the throne, in one of its many grim little jokes, arrived all the same. Some rulers rise into the office and enlarge themselves to fit it. John seemed instead to shrink the office down to the size of his fears and grievances. He was clever enough to scheme, quick enough to suspect insult, energetic enough to harry enemies, but not built in the way a realm like his required. The Angevin world he inherited was broad, complicated, expensive, and held together by more force of personality than was comfortable. To keep it, he needed disciplined statecraft, durable alliances, persuasive authority, and the ability to make powerful men feel that serving him served themselves. Instead, he had suspicion, appetite for extraction, vindictiveness, and a gift for making every opponent more necessary to himself and more disgusted with him at the same time. In France, land slipped away that earlier generations had treated almost as family bone. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, the old continental web of Plantagenet power, all became harder to hold under a king who could not reliably bind loyalty to his person. Some of that loss came from the strength of the French king. Some of it came from the brutal arithmetic of overextended rule. But John added his own special contribution. He made allies fear him, rivals hate him, and observers doubt him. He had the kind of temperament that can turn every political problem into a personal one. A suspected claimant is not merely monitored, but removed. A noble's duty is not negotiated, but squeezed. A disagreement is not a strain within the structure, but an insult to be paid for. A baron does not merely owe service, he owes submission in tone, in timing, in posture, in all the invisible currencies by which insecure rulers reassure themselves. And when a king begins to tax not only wealth but dignity, resistance grows in a very human way. John was not content merely to demand resources. He demanded them capriciously: scutage, reliefs, fines, feudal incidents, one pressure after another. The technical forms of royal right became under him a kind of permanent irritation. Men paid to avoid military service. Men paid to recover inheritances. Men paid because the king disliked them. Men paid because the king needed money for campaigns that did not restore what had already been lost. Even where the law supported him, the atmosphere around its use became poisonous. He did not merely raise revenue, he taught the political nation to associate his rule with exposure, humiliation, and arbitrary appetite. And once that feeling settles in, it is difficult to command anything larger than obedience under protest. Then there is the shadow of Arthur of Brittany, the nephew whose existence represented not just a dynastic complication, but the possibility of an alternative. Arthur vanished after capture. Medieval politics was not noted for softness, and yet even by the standards of the age, such disappearance had a smell that did not wash off. Whether John himself killed the boy with his own hands matters less in the long emotional memory of rule than the fact that people believed the worst of him easily. A king who has trained his realm to expect the meanest version of his nature rarely benefits from ambiguity. So the years pass, and the crown does what bad crowns often do. It grows heavier while seeming to provoke in its wearer only more stubbornness. By 1215, the great lords of England are done pretending that ordinary complaint will help. London is seized, negotiation turns armed. The king, once so certain of his rights, finds himself cornered into acknowledging that even he is not above law. And there on the meadow appears the document that later centuries will surround with so much solemn light. In the moment, of course, it is not yet that polished symbol. It is an emergency measure, a forced correction, a set of restraints written because a man with too much inherited authority has proved too unreliable to leave unchecked. There is something quietly funny about that, if one allows the comedy of history to flicker without fully smiling. John did not aim at liberty. He stumbled into constitutional memory by being so persistently intolerable that others began writing fences around him. And even then, he would not keep still long enough to let the correction hold. He sought annulment, he manoeuvred. Civil war followed. France was invited in by English hands. The realm that should have been held together by kingship became instead a place where kingship itself had become the problem to be solved. His death, when it comes, is messy, uncomfortable, and almost indecently suited to the texture of his reign. There is illness, exhaustion, retreat, a body giving way under pressure. Even the famous story of his lost baggage train, swallowed by the waters of the Wash, feels right, whether or not one lingers on the details. Of course, a ruler like this would seem to misjudge the very ground beneath him. Of course, the tide would take his treasures. Of course, rumour would preserve the image of royal wealth sinking out of reach into mud and shifting water. And yet, because history enjoys irony more than justice, John's catastrophe leaves behind a seed. Magna Carta does not immediately bloom into modern liberty. It is reissued, reinterpreted, reimagined across time. Still, the fact remains, one of England's most resented kings helped create one of the lasting symbols of limited rule by being exactly the kind of man who made limits necessary. Now, let the scene widen, and the centuries slip a little. The English shore is never entirely quiet for long. Wind from the sea carries not only salt, but warning. Long before John's barons gathered in a humid meadow, another English king had already shown how fear, hesitation, and bad counsel could train invaders to keep coming back. This is Ethelred, remembered by a nickname that later ages turned into a permanent shrug. Unready, they call him, though the older meaning is closer to badly advised, ill-counselled, poorly steered. That softer translation is almost kinder, though not by much. If John gives us the overbearing king who converts grievance into revolt, Ethelred gives us the anxious ruler who meets danger without coherence and teaches danger to grow expensive. He comes to the throne under a shadow, a murdered half-brother, a suspicious transition, a court already thick with unease. England itself is not a settled confidence, but a kingdom aware of raiders, aware of coastlines, aware that ships can appear like bad thoughts on grey water. What such a kingdom requires is steadiness and preparation, the building of response before panic, the hard, slow work of making defence feel habitual rather than improvised. But Ethelred inhabits rule, as though events are always arriving one step too soon. Viking attacks intensify, and instead of forging the kind of robust answer that would convince enemies England has a spine, he too often reaches for payment. Danegeld, silver to make danger leave, money to buy a little peace. To be fair, tribute in itself is not automatically idiotic in the medieval world. States bargained, bought time, paid off threats, hired old enemies. The problem is not one payment. The problem is the lesson repeated. If raiding brings silver, then raiding has become not just destruction, but policy. Picture the coastline from the invader's point of view. Monasteries vulnerable, towns uncertain, royal response slow, treasure real, and somewhere behind all of it, a king willing, under sufficient pressure, to open the treasury. That is not peace, that is an annual invitation written in coin. So the payments grow. Each settlement intended to quiet the sea only teaches the sea to speak louder. Every tribute that buys a season also purchases the next threat at a higher price. It is the sort of political trap that looks practical in the moment and ruinous in retrospect. And Ethelred walks into it again and again, not because he is incapable of thought, but because his thought never hardens into a whole strategy. He reacts, he soothes symptoms, he mistakes reprieve for solution. Then comes one of the most chilling misjudgments of his reign, because it reveals what anxious rule can become when it loses proportion. The order for the killing of Danes within England on St. Brice's Day is born of fear, suspicion, the belief that hidden enemies within will join enemies without. It is the logic of a ruler who sees threats everywhere and answers with a blow broad enough to create more threat still. Such acts do not restore confidence, they deepen fracture, they make coexistence impossible and revenge imaginable. And revenge, across the water, has ships, Sweyn Forkbeard, and later the larger Scandinavian pressure behind him, do not need Ethelred to be foolish in every moment. They need only the broad truth of his reign, which is that he has not taught England to feel well governed under stress. When invasion intensifies, the kingdom does what badly led kingdoms do. It wavers, it bargains, It fractures into promises and contingencies. The king flees to Normandy. Imagine the emotional damage of that. A king leaving his own realm to shelter elsewhere, while others sort out the cost of his failures. He does return, yes, and the story remains tangled, because medieval stories always are, but the deeper impression survives. Here is a ruler who could not convert fear into strength. He converted it into tribute, massacre, exile, and a long weakening of confidence. There is a temptation, with men like Ethelred, to imagine that some sharper will or sturdier nerve would have solved everything. Perhaps not. The era was genuinely dangerous. Viking warfare was adaptable, ruthless, maritime in ways that stretched old political reflexes. England would have struggled under better guidance than his. But poor conditions do not excuse poor pattern, and his pattern is clear enough. Too late, too uncertain, too much reaction, too little formation, counsel without command, measures without synthesis, so as the sea wind thins and the coast recedes in the mind. Let the listener notice what these first rulers share. One overreaches and squeezes until resistance becomes lawful memory. One hesitates and pays until predation becomes routine. Different temperaments, same result, legitimacy wounded from within. The realm learning slowly and expensively that the man at the centre cannot quite be trusted to act in the kingdom's long interest. Now, let the banners fall silent for a moment. Let the hoofs fade. Let the silver stop clinking into foreign hands. You are only listening. The meadow, the coast, the tent, the ships, the sharpened resentments, all of them are far away now. The bad choices have already happened. The kings are dead. The wax has long cooled. The papers are dry. Even the treasure stories rest under silt and tide. Breathe a little deeper. There are other kinds of failure ahead, quieter ones perhaps, and stranger. Not every realm is brought low by a king who scowls, extracts, and panics. Some empires are lost by men who seem almost to sink inside their own authority, as though power has made them heavy rather than sharp. And for that we travel eastward into the old Carolingian shadow. The Carolingian world, after Charlemagne, has the particular sadness of a house that still remembers its grandest builder. The roofline is impressive, the old foundation is there, people still point to the family name as though it itself can hold up the walls. But the beams have started to creak, and every new generation inherits not only the prestige, but the strain. Into that strain drifts Charles the Fat. There is something almost unfair about the nickname that history fastened to him, because medieval nicknames are rarely only physical. They are judgments disguised as description. To call a ruler fat in the chronicles is to suggest excess, softness, moral looseness, perhaps even divine disfavour made visible in flesh. Still, the name remains, and with it the image of a monarch too heavy in body or spirit to move at the pace his times required. Charles inherited in pieces, and then for a moment seemed to gather in his person an old imperial possibility. Lands in Alemannia, East Francia, Italy, eventually the imperial dignity itself. For a brief interval, it looked as though the old Carolingian spread might be reassembled under one hand. This should have been the sort of reign later storytellers adore. A grandson reclaiming the scattered grandeur of a titan. A realm gathered again from fragments, a sober and forceful restoration. Instead, it becomes a study in how inheritance can briefly enlarge a man without truly strengthening him. He ruled in a world of raiding, local instability, rival ambitions, and the slow loosening of old imperial cohesion. None of this was simple. No ruler of the late 9th century was being handed easy conditions. Yet crises do not only test systems, they test tempo, they test the speed at which a decision becomes action, and action becomes confidence in others. Charles seems always a little behind that rhythm, as though history reaches his chamber before he has fully woken. The image most often remembered is Paris under Viking siege. You can see it from a distance first, river traffic disrupted, defences strained, local commanders forced into desperate persistence. The city itself, not yet the polished capital of later centuries, but still a strategic and symbolic place enough to matter. Count Odo and the defenders hold on with the grim stubbornness frontier situations often demand. They improvise, endure, ration, wait, fight, pray. The siege lengthens. Hunger thickens the air. Leather is boiled when better food disappears. Men become tired in the ancient, total way that only fear and shortage can produce together. And what does the emperor do? He does not crash magnificently into battle, whether wisely or unwisely. He does not seize the moral center by visible sacrifice. He does not even fail with flamboyance. He delays, he negotiates, and then, in the decision that clings to his memory like damp wool, he pays the Vikings and allows them onward to trouble other parts of the realm. It is an almost perfect symbol of inert authority, not no action, but action so dispiriting that it drains faith from those who must live under it. If you are defending Paris, if you have endured months of pressure and privation, if you have believed relief might come in strength, what does such a settlement feel like? Not peace, not clever statecraft, more like being told that your suffering was a temporary inconvenience in someone else's calculations. Charles may have had reasons. There are always reasons. He may have been ill. He may have judged the broader balance of force poorly, but sincerely. He may have feared losses that would have shattered more than one city. Yet leadership is not measured only by hidden motives. It is measured by the impression of steadiness and purpose left behind. And Charles left behind, in too many places, the impression of a man ruling events after they had already decided themselves. The nobles noticed, of course they did. Nobles always notice a ruler whose caution begins to look like vacancy. A king can survive cruelty for a time if he remains formidable. He can survive error if he remains active. What is hardest to survive is the suspicion that he is simply not fully there, not fully taking hold, not fully inhabiting the danger of his own office. So within a year of the Paris settlement, he is deposed. The Carolingian spell weakens further. The great inheritance slides onward into partition, regionalization, the separate pathways that will, much later, look like France and Germany becoming more themselves, and less each other. Charles did not create all that fracture. It was there before him, but he wore it badly. He gave it no compelling center. He stood where restoration might have been imagined and instead embodied drift. There is something nearly tender in that failure, if one squints at it through sleepier eyes. He was not remembered as a monstrous tyrant or incandescent despot. He seems rather like a man asked to animate too much history with too little internal fire. The age required decisiveness, and he offered delay. The empire required confidence, and he offered management. The crisis required presence, and he seemed perpetually just elsewhere from it. Dimly ceremonial, while braver or hungrier, men did the hard surviving. And from that soft, sagging centre, authority passes onward to another Carolingian ending. One sadder still, because so little of it was the king's own doing. Ludwig, the child, comes to us not as a glaring fool, but as a tragedy of timing. A boy with a title large enough to crush him before he can even understand its language. He is still more symbol than self when he becomes ruler in East Francia. The old imperial world has not vanished, but it is fraying everywhere. External threats rise. Internal magnates harden into stronger local powers. Every regent and bishop who speaks for the boy also speaks, inevitably, a little for himself. To be crowned a child is to become the still point of other people's appetites. Picture him, not on a battlefield at first, but in procession. Small beneath cloth and metal, guided physically as well as politically, watched with the strange intensity adults reserve for children carrying adult meanings. The kingdom can still speak in his name. Documents can still issue under his seal. Ceremonies can still insist on continuity. But the real life of power is happening in rooms around him. In councils, in rivalries, in defensive failures, and ducal calculations over which he has almost no meaningful grip. And while the court arranges itself around his youth, the Magyars press in. Fast raiders from the east, difficult to answer with lumbering assumptions. They do not politely wait for a child king to grow into martial confidence. They arrive in the world that actually exists, not the one succession law might prefer. Villages burn, monasteries are shaken, regions begin to feel that they must depend on themselves because the king at the center is too far away, too young, too mediated by others to feel like immediate protection. This is the quieter horror of bad kingship, not outrage, not explosive decree, erosion. Under Ludwig, authority does not crash, it loosens. Dukes grow bolder, more autonomous, more like regional rulers in all but name. The Carolingian aura, once enough to organize obedience across wide spaces, dims. The boy matures in years perhaps, but never enough in power to reverse the pattern. There is no great moment in which he seizes command and startles everyone into renewed loyalty. There is only the gradual realization that the kingdom has learned to function around him rather than through him. When he dies young, the line in East Francia effectively ends with him. The symbolic weight of that is larger than his own person, which is one reason such reigns are so haunting. A child can be too small to command and still large enough to close an age, simply by dying. Let the listener notice the contrast between John and Ethelred on one side, Charles and Ludwig on the other. The English kings damaged legitimacy by doing too much of the wrong kind. The Carolingian figures damaged it, or revealed its fragility, by not truly occupying the centre at all. One kind of failure presses too hard, another leaves too much unheld. In both cases the result is similar. The surrounding powers begin to imagine life beyond the king's control. And perhaps that is the single most dangerous thing a ruler can teach his realm. Not hatred. Hatred can still fix on a person, not even fear. Fear still acknowledges force. No, the deeper danger is habituation. Nobles, bishops, regional leaders, foreign enemies, all of them gradually adapting to the idea that the king may be bypassed. Once that thought settles in, the throne is no longer the heart of the body politic. It is furniture. Now the Carolingian candles burn lower. The city walls recede. The child procession fades. The imperial promise gives off one last uneasy glow and then thins into memory. And from that memory we move toward another kingdom that will teach the same lesson differently. England again, but centuries later, not an angry king this time, nor a tribute-paying one, nor an emperor half asleep while his inheritance unravels. This time, a king whose gentleness itself becomes a kind of national peril. Henry VI has always felt to me like a candle being asked to stand in for a sword. He inherits magnificently and disastrously England, a claim to France the prestige of a warrior father, so bright that later memory nearly turns him into legend, and he inherits it all, as an infant, which is the first and perhaps cruelest imbalance of his reign. Before he can form a sentence, others are already speaking in his name. Before he can understand war, he is already associated with victories won by another man's body and will. Before he can decide what kind of king he wants to be, the office has already decided what kind of king the age expects. It expects another Henry V. That is a difficult ghost to live under. The boy grows, but not into that shape. He is not made for command in the old hard style. He inclines toward prayer, toward piety, toward learning, toward peace, in an era that interprets too much softness in a ruler as vacancy. On a private scale, there is something almost admirable in him. One can imagine him as a conscientious prior, a patron of schools, founder of colleges, a man remembered for inward sincerity. But the crown does not ask what private life would have suited a person. It demands public force, and Henry, whatever his virtues, does not radiate force. So the kingdom begins the long, slow work of reacting to his insufficiency. How? At first, this is disguised by councils and routines. England knows how to govern around infancy. France remains contested in ways familiar enough to earlier generations. Great lords still maneuver, but maneuvering is normal. The fabric holds outwardly, yet beneath the surface, a subtler reality forms. If the king does not settle disputes decisively, then disputes learn to swell. If the king recoils from conflict, then stronger personalities gather around him and around the spaces he leaves unoccupied. If the king cannot convert inherited grandeur into present confidence, then the inherited grandeur itself starts to look like a costume. Henry's French losses are often told as military history, and they are that, but in the deeper emotional sense, they are also a story about presence. Lands are lost because enemies are strong. Commanders vary. Finances strain, and the Old English hold on France was always more fragile than triumphant memory liked to admit. Yet the atmosphere of Henry's reign amplifies every reverse. He does not seem to answer disaster with a more persuasive embodiment of kingship. Instead, the losses drift into the larger judgment that the king is not carrying his office well enough for an age of pressure. And then comes the breakdown. A kingdom can endure many things from a ruler. What is hardest to endure is a visible absence at the centre, precisely when the structure is shaking. Henry's collapse into catatonic stillness, in the middle of crisis, feels almost too symbolic to be true. And yet, that is why it has survived so vividly in memory. Here is a king through whom nothing passes: petition, danger, birth, rivalry, state necessity, all arrive before him and meet a blankness they cannot penetrate. It is as though the monarchy itself has gone dark. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, becomes in consequence one of the most vivid presences in the story, because vacuum invites force. She is political where he is devotional, alert where he is withdrawn, determined where he is diffuse. To some she is saviour, to others manipulator, but either way her prominence makes plain what the reign has become. The kingdom is no longer reading authority naturally off the king. It is reading it around him. This matters more than any single battle, because civil war feeds first on uncertainty of centre. The great houses begin to sharpen against one another. York and Lancaster cease to be merely genealogical stories and become armed alternatives. If the king cannot command confidence, then others may claim that they can. If the king cannot defend his son's future clearly, then the future itself becomes contestable. England moves not because everyone suddenly turns monstrous, but because a weak crown gives old ambitions room to stand upright. The Wars of the Roses are many things, but among them is the sound of a realm trying to resolve by force what a stronger kingship might once have contained by authority. Henry drifts through that storm, like a man walking inside someone else's dream. Captured, restored, hidden, displayed, revered by some, pitied by others, increasingly more symbol than sovereign. There are even later murmurs of sanctity around him, as if people, sensing how badly his temperament matched his office, tried to relocate him into a spiritual register where gentleness could count as triumph instead of failure. That too feels fitting. He may have been a holy man, misplaced onto a throne. It is tempting to say that makes him innocent. History is rarely that generous. A gentle king can still preside over terrible outcomes. Softness in the wrong place is not neutral. It can cost as much as cruelty, only more diffusely. Under Henry, England does not merely suffer because he is wicked. It suffers because he is not enough command, not enough sharpness, not enough ability to stop stronger actors from turning the kingdom into a board on which they settle what the crown no longer can. And when he dies in the Tower, quietly, and almost certainly by force despite the decorative explanations later offered, it feels less like the end of a commanding reign than the extinguishing of a long uncertainty. The body disappears. The question he could never answer remains. What is a king for, if not to hold the centre when others begin to tear at it? From Henry's misted chambers, let the mind wander not to louder kings, but to emptier thrones, to men who wore authority without ever quite filling it, whether because stronger neighbours overshadowed them, because noble society had already moved beyond what their title could command, or because the very old story of kingship was thinning beneath them. Louis V of West Francia, remembered by the uncharitable label of the sluggard, stands at one of those thresholds. His reign is short enough to feel almost like a shrug in time, and yet that very brevity reveals something important. By the late 10th century, the old Carolingian world in the West is not gone but exhausted. Real power lives in dukes, counts, regional blocks, church networks, local strongmen with estates, horses, and memories of serving the crown only when convenient. The king remains sacred in theory, diminished in practice. Louis does not so much destroy this arrangement as fail to reverse it. He has a marriage alliance that collapses almost as soon as it begins. He has a father who tries, in effect, to train continuity into existence by associating his son with rule before the older generation is gone. He has the usual royal symbols, the expected processions, the dignity of office. What he does not seem to possess is the energy or imagination to make those symbols bite into reality. He hunts, he drifts, he reigns as though kingship were a set of appearances someone else will maintain if he merely keeps showing up. But late dynastic worlds are not maintained by showing up. They are maintained, when they are maintained at all, by relentless labour against centrifugal force. By making regional powers calculate that obedience still pays. By giving ambitious men enough reason to remain clients rather than alternatives. Louis does little of that. Perhaps he could not have done much. Perhaps the old line had already become too hollow, the crown too ceremonial, the balance too far gone. Historians can argue that point by the fire for as long as they like. What remains emotionally true is that his reign feels like the monarchy forgetting to defend its own necessity. Then he dies young, after scarcely ruling at all, and with him something larger also ends. The Carolingian line in France gives way to Capetian future. A different house steps forward with stronger local base, more practical power, more suitability to the actual distribution of force. Louis becomes, in consequence, one of those rulers whose greatest historical action is to fail in a way that clears the ground for someone else. There is a sadness to such kings. They are not always evil. Sometimes they are merely late. And northward, in Scotland, another man will wear a crown almost as if it were loaned to him by a stronger enemy. John Balliol comes to the Scottish throne by process, by arbitration, by the intervention of Edward I of England, which is already a warning disguised as a solution. Scotland needs a king after the death of the Maid of Norway. Claims multiply, great families angle. Edward offers mediation, and, beneath mediation, overlordship. Balliol accepts what he perhaps imagines to be a formality. In doing so, he lets his kingship be born under another ruler's shadow. This is not the same as weakness of character alone. It is structural from the beginning. To be chosen in such circumstances is to be immediately tested on whether you can convert a compromised accession into real authority. Balliol does not. Edward treats him less like a sovereign partner than a subordinate. Appeals go south. Interference deepens. The title king begins to sound, in practice, like an honorific attached to dependency. Such things are survivable only if the ruler then performs some memorable act of national coherence. Balliol instead hesitates between submission and resistance, when at last he leans toward alliance with France and defiance of England. The movement is too thin, too late, too unsupported by settled confidence at home. Edward invades, Scottish forces fail. Balliol is humiliated publicly, stripped in ceremony, reduced to the mocking memory of empty tabard, empty coat, empty kingship. What interests me is not the humiliation alone, but the emotional lesson it taught. A king can be erased in public only if enough people have already doubted that he truly embodied the nation in the first place. Balliol was not simply defeated, he was revealed as unconvincing, and again the pattern returns. The throne occupied yet hollow, the title intact, yet bypassed, the realm already imagining other centres of loyalty. Let all these gentler failures gather for a moment around the listener like dimmed portraits. Henry, with his piety and absence, Louis, with his late dynastic languor, Balliol, with his compromised sovereignty, different lands, different centuries, different personal textures, yet all teaching the same slow lesson. A kingdom cannot long afford a monarch who is only technically there. Now let the rooms empty, let the noble factions dissolve back into corridors. Let the fog lift from England, the hunting woods recede from West Francia. The Scottish crown room go dark. You are not trapped inside any of those courts, you are outside them. Listening, the dynasties that seem so permanent have already become reading matter. The men who worried over succession, tribute, border law, and personal insult are thin as breath now. Their seals are museum objects, their prisons are ruins, their battle standards are names in books. Rest there for a moment, because the next kind of ruler is not merely absent or unequal. He is unstable, or brutal, or both. The danger moves inward now, into temperament, bloodline, obsession, vanity, and the private weather of a mind that happens to sit on a throne, and that can make an old palace feel colder than any battlefield. There are rulers who fail because they cannot act. There are rulers who fail because they act badly, and then there are figures at the edge of kingship who remind us that the throne is not merely a political object. It is an amplifier. Whatever trembles or curdles inside the person placed upon it becomes public weather. In Spain, under the dark cloth and disciplined ceremony of the Habsburg age, that truth takes on a particularly haunted form in Don Carlos. He is not, strictly speaking, one of our crowned kings, but he belongs in this night because he represents a terrifying possibility that hovered just beside the throne. The heir who might have ruled, the body prepared for succession, the prince in whom dynastic inheritance had done its strange and dangerous work. If some failed kings reveal the weakness of systems, Don Carlos reveals the fragility of dynastic confidence itself. He is what happens when a great empire stares at its own future and does not like the face staring back. His father, Philip II, is cold order made human. Black cloth, measured speech, prayer yoked to administration. Empire organized through paper, councils, surveillance, and relentless seriousness. Philip rules vast territories and treats governance as if it were both burden and vocation. He may not be warm, but he is form. He is structure. He is the opposite of improvisation. Then there is the sun. Don Carlos grows under the pressure of expectation and inheritance in a family line so committed to dynastic tightening that nature herself seems to recoil. His body is frail, uneven, marked, but it is his mind that frightens the court. Stories gather early around his volatility, his cruelty, his inability to absorb refusal. Some tales may be embroidered. Royal courts are generous weavers of monstrous rumour. Yet embroidery requires fabric, and there seems to have been enough fabric here. Sudden rages, dark impulses, a taste for domination that exceeded youthful arrogance and entered the realm of instability. The palace, with all its chapels and etiquette and dark long corridors, becomes the ideal setting for such a figure. It is a place where everyone watches and nobody speaks plainly, a place where a prince can be indulged, feared, managed, concealed. Don Carlos wants significance, and why would he not? He is the heir to one of the mightiest monarchies of the age. But wanting significance and bearing it are not the same. He wants command without discipline, position without restraint, perhaps even admiration without deserving it. When denied serious responsibility, he turns denial into injury. When told no, he reads conspiracy, he fixates, he mutters treasonous possibilities. He imagines flight, revolt, political reversal. The exact medical terms later centuries might apply do not matter half so much as the felt atmosphere around him. He is becoming a danger, not because he is merely unpleasant, but because no one can trust what shape his will may take next. That is the kind of fear dynasties hate most, not the fear of an external army, which can be named and fought, but the fear of succession itself. The tragedy deepens because the court can no longer solve the problem in public language. It cannot say, the future king is not fit. It cannot safely permit him power and hope temperament will mend under ceremony. It cannot remove him openly without exposing the myth that bloodline and providence guarantee continuity. So it does what threatened monarchies often do. It converts the family crisis into silence, enclosure, guarded corridors, official vagueness. Philip arrests his own son. Pause there, because even in an age of hard fathers and brutal statecraft, that remains shocking. The heir, the only legitimate son, confined, not exiled ceremonially, not corrected lightly, confined behind walls and reports and controlled access. Whatever tenderness existed between father and son by then had long since been smothered under fear, disappointment, and the larger cold need of empire to preserve itself from its own blood. When Don Carlos dies after months of isolation, rumour does the rest. Poison, neglect, madness, divine judgment, the stories bloom because the palace has made storytelling necessary. Later centuries, sentimental in their own way, will sometimes try to rescue him into romance, turning him from unstable princeling into misunderstood victim of paternal absolutism. Yet the darker and quieter truth is almost more compelling. He was dangerous and pitiable at once. A young man bred for supreme responsibility by a dynasty that trusted lineage too much and human fragility too little. Close the shutters on Spain for a moment and move westward into the harsher light of Castile in an earlier century. where the instability is not hidden behind etiquette so much as lived at knife point. Peter of Castile is one of those rulers whose memory cannot settle on one name, because his reign cannot settle on one moral. Peter the cruel, say many. Peter the just, say others. The split itself tells you something important. He was not a lazy cipher or a child placeholder. He was active, forceful, reforming in some directions, brutal in others, and perhaps most dangerous when the two merged. Kings who believe they are correcting disorder can become strangely inventive in the severity they permit themselves. He grows up amid family poison, illegitimate half-brothers, a sidelined mother, a father with favoured mistresses and divided loyalties. The court around him is already a school for insecurity. Such childhoods do not prepare a prince for magnanimity. They prepare him to see rivals early and everywhere. By the time Peter becomes king, plague shadows the peninsula. Aristocratic power remains sharp, and the social world is brittle enough that any king wishing to centralize authority will quickly create enemies. In one sense, Peter understands the problem clearly. The nobility of Castile is dangerous, overmighty, accustomed to treating royal will as one pressure among many. Administrative reform, stronger crown justice, more equitable taxation, stricter response to noble abuse, all of these can appear under his reign, not as fantasies but as real efforts. It is easy to see why some later voices wanted to call him just. There is a recognizable state-building logic in him. But logic in government becomes terrible when mixed with personal vengeance and theatrical cruelty. Peter does not merely restrain enemies, he annihilates, humiliates, terrifies, rivals die, kin of rivals, die. Noble opposition becomes not a political challenge to manage, but a field of fear to keep widening until no challenge remains. At least, that is the hope. The problem with rule by fear is not that fear never works. It often works very well in the short term. The problem is that it simplifies the political world into enemies who must be crushed and survivors who must pretend not to be waiting. In such a world, the king becomes strong and lonely at once. His private life offers no refuge from this pattern. Marriage, mistress, favoritism, jealousy, suspicious deaths, all the ingredients by which royal intimacy turns public. The woman he should have cherished as queen is discarded. The woman he loves, or clings to, becomes a kind of emotional exception in a life otherwise run on suspicion and wrath. Personal contradiction becomes political climate. A ruler cannot keep separate compartments for cruelty and tenderness when both are enacted under the same crown. And always behind him is the rival half-brother Henry of Trastamara, embodiment of dynastic grievance made military. Their conflict is not only about temperament, it is about who gets to define legitimacy itself. Peter may be the lawful king, but law alone cannot save a ruler who has frightened too many of the people he needs. So civil war hardens, foreign alliances mix in, England and France, as they so often do, appear through their own interests. The peninsula becomes one more stage on which larger European rivalries reflect through personal blood feud. Peter briefly regains advantage that matters because failed kings are not always losers from the start. Some shine in bursts, some are formidable until suddenly they are not. That is what makes them interesting to tell in the dark. Peter is not a man sleepily misplacing power. He clutches it too tightly, and in that grip he crushes the trust that might have made victory durable. When he finally dies at Montiel, stabbed after confrontation with the very brother who has long shadowed him, the ending feels medieval in the purest way. Family, steel, betrayal, legitimacy, decided by hands at close range. A tent, a struggle, a body on the ground. a dynasty turning because one man has lost not only the war, but the personal battle inside his reign between justice and cruelty. Then northward again, into Bohemia, where the danger is less concentrated, perhaps, but the mood no less unsettling. Wenceslaus IV inherits from a father of immense stature, Charles IV, whose reign had given Prague splendour, prestige, and a sense of cultivated order. To follow such a father is a dangerous thing. It creates a hall of mirrors in which every lesser gesture becomes a disappointment. Wenceslaus never quite breaks free of that inheritance. He reigns instead like a man half interested in kingship and half annoyed that the job requires other people. He enjoys art, books, pleasure, the enclosed satisfactions of courtly life. There is nothing inherently wrong in a ruler-loving culture. Indeed, it can be one of the gentler graces of kingship. But grace, without steadiness, soon looks like indulgence, especially when politics outside the chamber grow rough. The Holy Roman world of his time is not restful. German princes are fractious. Bohemia itself is tense. Church corruption and reformist feeling are building towards storms not yet fully named. In such a landscape, irregular kingship becomes dangerous. Wenceslaus offers irregularity in abundance. He neglects major imperial duties. He alienates important figures. He oscillates between passivity and bursts of alarming violence. He drinks, he withdraws, he returns unpredictably, he lets resentment gather. He does not consistently arbitrate, and so others begin to arbitrate by faction. If a strong ruler is like a fire around which rival interests must measure themselves, Wenceslaus is more like uncertain weather. One cannot plan around him, only around the possibility that he may suddenly flare or disappear. There is even the astonishing fact that his own nobles at one point kidnap him. That alone should place a ruler among the memorable failures of the age. Not because kidnapping a king automatically proves the kidnapper's right, but because it proves that a significant body of powerful men no longer experiences the king as inviolable centre. They experience him as obstacle, inconvenience, perhaps even hazard. Yet, as with so many of these men, he is not without appealing traits. He genuinely patronizes manuscripts. He leaves behind splendid artistic traces. The famous Wenceslas Bible glows as evidence that under his rule beauty could still be commissioned. Labour-funded, script and image cherished. There is something almost heartbreaking in that contrast. The man who could sustain brilliant books could not sustain confidence in his government. He could preserve illuminated pages while letting the political margins darken around him. That is worth lingering over, because it reminds us how human failed rulers remain. They are not always devoid of taste, tenderness, or even insight. Their failure lies in mismatch, a collector where an arbiter is needed, a dreamer where a disciplinarian must stand, a volatile man where continuity is precious, a frightened heir where empire wants assurance, a reformer with blood on his hands, a king too inward, a king too brittle, a king too would have been entirely acceptable as a patron, a monk, a country lord, even a family eccentric, but not as the load-bearing beam of a state. Now, let the palace doors close one by one. The Spanish chamber with its guarded silence, the Castilian tent with its final struggle, the Prague rooms cluttered with art and bad temper. Let them all drift away from the mind like lit windows seen from a road at night, and return, as promised, to safety. There is no need to carry their instability into your own breathing. The Habsburg corridors are far from this room. The knives are sheathed in time. The angry brothers are dust. The nobles who dragged their king into confinement have names most people will never speak again. The manuscripts remain, perhaps the buildings remain in parts, but the fear inside those courts has thinned to story. Let your shoulders loosen, the middle of the night is for softer steps now. We are past the loudest edge of the story, and what remains is not a catalogue of disaster, but a slower sinking into the sadness of crowns themselves. Because, as we move toward the end, the pattern changes again. Failure will become more atmospheric, more tragic, more touched by irony. Less about the ruler's stupidity alone, more about how a life can be overtaken by the role it inherited. By the story its dynasty told about it, by the body it carried, by the age that closed too quickly around it. The torches are lower now, the roads are muddier, and the next kings we meet will seem, in different ways, already to be moving toward an ending. Toward the end of a long gallery of failed rulers, tone begins to change on its own. The laughter, if there was any, grows quieter, the judgments soften into observation. It becomes harder to say where incompetence ends and tragedy begins. Some kings are not remembered because they blundered every day of their reign, but because their endings gather up the fragility of kingship more perfectly than any lecture could. James II of Scotland is one of those figures. He was not the sleepiest ruler we have met tonight, nor the most absent, nor the most obviously unfit. In some ways he was energetic, martial, very much engaged in the serious business of making a king feel kingly. He wanted strong monarchy, secure authority, the reduction of overmighty subjects, the visible theatre of action. There are many worse ambitions for a medieval ruler. Yet history, with its pitiless eye for symbolism, often cares less about intention than about final image. And James's final image is extraordinary. He dies while besieging Roxburgh, brought down not by some elegant enemy reversal, but by the explosion of one of his own guns. Cannon, still comparatively new and temperamental enough to inspire awe, had begun to change warfare. To stand near them was to stand near the future. To command them was to look modern, forceful, dangerous. And in one burst of metal failure, that future breaks around the king. It is difficult to invent a more medievally ironic death. A ruler eager to embody strength and offensive pressure is undone by his own artillery. The machine of war he embraces answers him not with victory, but with sudden ruin. Even if one knew nothing else of his reign, the story would survive because it compresses so much into one terrible instant. Ambition, technology, spectacle, and the indifference of matter to kings. Yet even here, what lingers in the mind for sleep is not only the explosion. It is the image just before it, the siege camp at dusk, the heavy tubes of iron or bronze in place, engineers, soldiers, servants, horses, smoke, command, the king among them, still assuming that mastery is a thing a crowned man can borrow from the scene around him. Then the break, the chaos, the body, the sudden realization that majesty is made of the same vulnerable material as everyone else. From Scotland, let the night roll east and south toward Hungary, where another king will be remembered not for ruling long and badly, but for vanishing into catastrophe in a way that feels almost dreamlike. Louis, the Second of Hungary, inherits danger in bulk. The Ottoman pressure is real and expanding. The old balance in Central Europe is shifting. Resources, alliances, and military readiness are all under strain. He is young, and youth in such moments is rarely a romance. It is exposure. The court around him is not a unified organism, but a tangle of magnates, interests, expectations, and limitations. The kingdom needs not only courage, but a whole working system behind that courage. Too often, it does not have one. Then comes Moax. The battle has become almost a synonym for devastation in Hungarian memory, which tells you something already. There are defeats, and then there are defeats that sound afterward like a country's breath being knocked out. The Ottoman army is formidable, disciplined, experienced, and strategically superior. The Hungarian side is brave in parts, but badly placed, hurried, compromised by command problems and insufficient coordination. Louis is there because a king must be there. That is one of the terrible old rules of monarchy. Presence is necessary, even when presence solves nothing. The battle goes badly, then very badly, then irretrievably. Lines break, confusion swallows command. What had been a field of banners becomes a field of panic. And somewhere in the retreat, in mud and water and armour, the king disappears from power into mortality. He falls, perhaps is thrown, perhaps trapped by the sheer dead weight of what he wears, and drowns. A drowned king after a lost battle. There is something almost mythically sad about that. No final speech, no orderly retreat into exile, no saintly imprisonment, just the body of a young ruler, lost in the mud-thick consequences of a collapse larger than himself. Could he have done more? Could anyone in his position have reversed that tide? These are questions historians ask, because historians are noble creatures who cannot pass a battlefield without setting out imaginary alternatives. But for our purposes, the emotional truth is enough. Louis stands for the ruler who arrives in history, just as history has decided to become too large and too violent for his inherited frame. He does not so much misgovern every detail as embody the tragic insufficiency of dynastic youth in the face of imperial force. And then there is Manfred of Sicily, one of the most haunting of all our late figures, because he glows. Not literally, of course, though southern kingship, papal conflict, Mediterranean light all lend his memory a sharper colour than the northern courts. What I mean is that he does not drift across the page like a blank king. He flashes, he is intelligent, cultivated, politically agile, brave in the field, an illegitimate son, carrying the glamour and danger of the Hohenstaufen line at a moment when that line is under immense pressure from the papacy and its allies. He has all the ingredients of the sort of ruler romance likes to rescue, and yet his reign is a lesson in how brilliance can still be structurally doomed. To rule Sicily in his moment is to stand in a zone where local authority, imperial claim, papal hostility, and international intervention knot together tightly. Manfred is not facing merely rebellious nobles or one hostile cousin. He is facing a world in which his legitimacy is contested at the highest level, where the Pope can make and unmake atmospheres around kingship, where foreign claimants can be invited in under banners of moral and legal correction. In another age, with another inheritance, he might have become a durable statesman king. In this one, he becomes a splendid problem. He governs well enough in many respects. He is not indolent. He is not mentally absent. He is not a child puppet. Yet none of that guarantees permanence. That is one of the more soothing and sobering truths history offers. Merit matters, but context matters too. A king may be far more capable than the men we have already passed, and still lose, because the net around him is too wide, the claims against him too sanctified, the coalition facing him too large. His end at Benevento carries the clean sadness of doomed valour. He rides into battle against Charles of Anjou, the French-backed instrument of papal design. He knows much is at stake, his line, his kingdom, his whole political world perhaps. The battle goes against him, some of his men desert or falter. And still he rides. There is a point, in stories like this, where failure stops feeling comic and becomes almost luminous. Manfred reaches that point, the failed king, as tragic knight, the ruler who cannot outlive the hostile logic of his age. When his body is found and buried without grandeur, later moved again under the pressure of papal disapproval. Even the treatment of his corpse seems to say that kingship extends its quarrels beyond death. He cannot simply fall, he must be posthumously managed, judged, relocated. Such is the instability of a ruler who embodied too much contested meaning. If James shows us the king undone by his own weapon, and Louis the king swallowed by battlefield collapse, Manfred shows us the capable ruler overtaken by converging forces greater than personal competence. And together they soften our understanding of failure. Not every failed king is ridiculous. Not every doomed reign deserves a smirk. Some deserve only the quieter recognition that a crown can place a person exactly where his finest qualities will be least sufficient. There are other late figures one might pause beside in this dim corridor. Men whose marriages or claims or bodily limits drew whole realms into uncertainty. Men whose personal fixations became public fracture. Men who inherited too little time. Men who inherited too much legend. But the pattern by now is clear enough to rest on gently. Kings are not merely judged by what they intend, they are judged by whether the age around them can survive what they are. Some ages need a hammer and receive a candle. Some need patience and receive a rage. Some need imagination and receive appetite. Some need a public father and receive a frightened son. Some need a whole functioning centre and receive a title balanced on a mind already splitting under pressure. Some need, most simply, someone present enough to be believed in. And even that small miracle is rarer than coronation ritual likes to admit. So let the battlefields dim, the cannon smoke thins over Roxburgh, the mud of Mohacs cools, the southern dust of Benevento settles into the grass. Horses fade from the mind, armour becomes weightless, because it is only memory now. The kings are down, the banners are lowered, the chroniclers dip their pens and begin their dangerous work of deciding which endings were glorious, which foolish, which sinful, which instructive. We do not need to decide so sharply tonight. We can simply notice how frail the whole theatre was. And once you notice that, another thought arrives very softly, like a draft under a door. It is the thought that these stories remain vivid, not because crowns are exotic, but because patterns of unfit power are never entirely foreign. That thought, too, can be taken slowly. There is a temptation at the end of a journey like this to pull everything into a neat lesson, to say, here is what the bad kings teach us, here is the moral, here is the clean ribbon that ties all the centuries together. But history, especially history told at night, resists that kind of tidy knotting. It is enough, perhaps, to notice the recurring shape. A society builds a throne, and then spends generations pretending the throne can correct a human being who occupies it. Birth becomes proof, ceremony becomes reassurance, lineage becomes argument, the court dresses uncertainty in velvet and incense and calls it continuity. And for a while that works, sometimes for a long while, long enough that the whole arrangement begins to feel natural. Then the wrong person inherits, or the merely insufficient person, or the good but misplaced one, or the brilliant one facing a structure already rigged against him. And suddenly, everyone around the throne begins the old medieval improvisation. Nobles edge outward, bishops speak more boldly, foreign powers test the seams. Queens, uncles, brothers, mistresses, ministers and regents all step closer to the centre. The king responds with fear, fury, prayer, delay, tribute, silence, spectacle, harshness, or some blend of them all. And ordinary people, who never asked for any of this, absorb the consequences in taxes. Empty fields, conscription, hunger, uncertainty, and the long ache of being governed badly from far away. Perhaps that is why these stories still feel familiar without needing to become modern. We do not have to force the comparison. We do not have to drag the present into the room by name. It is enough to feel the old pattern breathe once and then fade. Power granted too easily. Authority protected too long. Systems defending the image of leadership after the substance has begun to leak away. The costumes change, the rooms change, the paperwork changes. Human beings, in their hopeful and disastrous arrangements, perhaps change less than they like to think. But let that thought drift past rather than settle too heavily. You do not need to carry it. You do not need to solve monarchy or power or history or the old question of why societies so often confuse inheritance with wisdom. You only need to notice softly that behind all the robes and standards and genealogies were human creatures. Tired creatures, proud creatures, frightened creatures. Men who wanted to be obeyed, to be admired, to be secure, to be remembered well, to silence rivals, to please God, to please fathers, to outlive brothers, to steady realms, to enjoy comfort, to avoid pain, to believe that the crown on their head meant they were equal to it. Some were not, some might have been, in gentler roles, some became less themselves, and more the damage around them. And now, all of them belong to the same great hush that takes every court in the end. Imagine the palaces after, not at the height of ceremony, but years later, a window broken and patched, a hall repurposed, a treasury counted under new seals, old portraits taken down, monks copying records of disputes no one alive remembers feeling, children of another dynasty running in courtyards where once a king raged or froze or doubted himself into disaster, a chapel lamp burning before a tomb whose occupant was once the centre of a political universe and is now a name spoken correctly only by specialists. This is one of the gentlest comforts history offers. Nothing holds the stage forever, not the strongest emperor, not the most terrifying invader, not the most scheming court, not even the most humiliating failure. Everything passes from emergency into memory, from memory into footnote, from footnote into stone, and from stone into weather. Even a crown becomes, eventually, just metal under glass. So come back, slowly, to the room you are in now. Feel the ordinary safety of it. The ceiling above you that is not a vaulted chamber. The walls that do not hide armed retainers. The silence that is not political. The darkness that asks nothing of you except rest. No courier is pounding at your gate with news from the border. No bishop waits with a sealed accusation. No nobles are gathering at a meadow to limit your authority. No cannon is being rolled into place beneath your window. No horse is carrying you toward a muddy field where an empire waits to decide your fate. Tonight, you do not have to inherit anything, no kingdom, no dynasty, no impossible comparison to a dead father, no unpaid war, no frightened council, no boyhood crown too large for your brow, no throne that turns every private weakness into public consequence. You may simply let all of that remain where it belongs, in the deep old distances. And if one or two images stay with you as sleep approaches, let them be soft ones. A candle guttering in a drafty hall, rain on a keep roof, the slow unfolding of parchment on a table, hooves going quiet in mud, a river carrying moonlight past a city wall, the rustle of velvet, the last ember in a brazier, a manuscript page turning in careful hands, a crown being lifted away at last from a tired human head. Perhaps that is the most fitting ending for a night among failed kings. Not judgment, not triumph, just relief. Relief that the crown can come off. Relief that the hall can empty. Relief that somewhere beyond the reach of old banners and inherited disasters, there is a smaller, kinder kingdom made only of blankets, breath, darkness, and the slow surrender of wakefulness. So let the kings keep their ruined meadows, and collapsing empires, and quarrelsome bloodlines. Let John remain in his hot tent with reluctant ink. Let Ethelred listen to the sea, he never learned to answer. Let Charles drift among the remnants of his grandfather's impossible dream. Let little Ludwig pass under the hands of regents and disappear into the end of a line. Let Henry kneel in prayer while stronger wills move around him. Let Louis ride hunting through a monarchy already forgetting itself. Let Balliol fade across the channel with an empty title. Let Don Carlos pace his dimmed chamber. Let Peter grip justice and cruelty so tightly he can no longer tell them apart. Let Wenceslaus turn another jeweled page while politics crack outside. Let James stand too near the gun. Let Louis sink under armour and mud. Let Manfred ride toward the bright fatal dust. Let them all sink back into the long medieval night from which we borrowed them for a while. And you, having passed quietly among them, may drift elsewhere now. Not abruptly, not all at once, just a little further from the torches, a little further from the banners, a little further from the sound of iron, a little further from the rooms where people mistook inherited power for certainty. The night is larger than their kingdoms, the dark is gentler than their courts, and somewhere ahead, already, sleep is gathering itself softly, like a curtain moving in a draught, like mist over a field. No army will cross. Tonight, like a hand lowering the final light, without ever quite putting it out.